We are going to speak about post-traumatic reactions in a long-term and several generation perspective, which is a new approach to post-traumatic stress, because it also includes the cultural traits of a nation in a way, or a local community. It means that we are not only occupied with the individuals, but also about how they transfer the trauma to the next generation. Norway is very much a coastal nation. We have a long coastline and a lot of people have their living from the sea, which means that shipping accidents and accidents at sea is a main factor in the life of many communities. Historically speaking, it has been very much like that, which also means that Norway is very connected to many other countries through the sea. Our main examples, and this is partly a historical study and partly a social science study, is from two big accidents at sea. One called Piper Alpha in the British sector, 167 killed, and one called Alexander Kielland, which was an oil platform that collapsed with 123 people killed. In addition, we have some examples from war trauma. We have also making studies about war traumas from the Second World War and the First World War and the Finnish Winter War, which means that we have historical examples for about 100 years period. And we're looking into how those traumas are influencing people today. Particularly the last or the second of those, the Alexander Kielland trauma, we have been continuously interviewing people, relatives, grandchildren, and people involved in the accident. It happened in 1980, so it's 37 years ago. 3 days ago, we had, on Monday, we had the last of those interviews. And it's quite illustrating. It was with a lady who's in her 40s. She did not remember her father, who died in the Alexander Kielland accident. But she had her whole life shaped by her mother's trauma and her mother's way of reacting to the trauma. In a way, this is very personal also for me. I have my life partly shaped by my parents, who were active during the Second World War and the Finnish Winter War. My mother was born in 1921, a long time ago. She's nearly 100 years old. As a young lady, she was very active during the Finnish Winter War, which was a great trauma for the nation of Finland. She had never really had any reactions to that trauma before recently. After the 1990s, after she turned 90 years old, she has had some post-traumatic reactions. For health and social workers, as well as relatives, it's important to be aware of how the trauma of the past sometimes reappear long time after the incident itself. But returning to the lady we interviewed 3 days ago, all our interviews are historical recordings. So we mostly operate with the name of the people we interview. They do not wish to be anonymous. I think she was 3 or 4 years old, 4 years old when the accident appeared and her father lost his life. And she was dealing with her mother. She had to be the mother to her mother from about that age. It's a very common situation for a lot of children. And when we have made presentations in Norway about the Alexander Kielland accident, many people make parallels to traffic accidents and other accidents where children get into the role of being the parents of their parents or being the caregivers in their own families. Most studies we have had on post-traumatic stress has so far focused on the victims which have been directly involved in accidents. While it seems like from historical studies like we have been doing, that some of the greatest stress is often on bystanders and family members and not so much on the people directly involved in the accidents. Both by health and social workers, those people which are not directly involved in the accident are to a great extent ignored. But I would like to mention one group of professionals which often get very involved in those kind of issues. And they are the teachers and the kindergarten teachers in kindergartens. But they have to deal with the children as part of large groups of children. But of course, in a case like the Alexander Kielland accident, there were 212 people on the oil platform, 123 died, and there were a large number of survivors. 89 survivors. In a case like that, a teacher in a classroom will also have to deal with children which are extremely happy of having their parents surviving, as well as the children who have lost their fathers. It's a rather complicated contrast, dealing with grief at the same time as dealing with extreme happiness. But returning to the case of 3 days ago, the mothers to the young girl, she just withered away. She did not cope with life. She did not cope economically. She did not cope socially, and she did not manage life. And after a while, of course, she died. She also had a brother, and he got continuous emotional reactions to the accident. While this young girl we interviewed, she coped very well. She managed life, and she got into a management position in the welfare system. So she is, from one point, very successful. From the other point, she's still struggling with the memory and the trauma of the past 37 years ago. But of course, this Alexander Kielland accident not only involved the people who were present at the oil platform, but also a tremendously large-scale rescue operation. There were civilian ships from more than 100 nations, and some of them were actually also from Poland. And there were military rescue operations from all the North Sea countries. And there were a large-scale system which were mobilized ashore in Britain, Holland, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. Many of the people involved in the rescue operation were very, very young. Some of them were 16 years old. In Norway, rescue workers in the Red Cross volunteer organization were down to 15 and 16 years old. Taking the dead bodies ashore and taking care of the survivors was the responsibility ashore of very, very young people, and many of them volunteers, because the system in Norway, and most of them came ashore in Norway, did not have dimensions to cope with it with professionals. For many of those people, the accident was traumatic as well, but they're mostly ignored by the research we have been doing on post-traumatic stress. But some of the greatest stress has actually not been on the people directly in the accident, but on all the bystanders, and sometimes even most on the people who saw the accident and who were very near the accident, but could not do anything about it. They did not have any capacity to help. After the accident, we developed systems for taking care of the reactions of the helpers, as well as teachers, and as well as in the church and ashore with health and social services. We developed new routines to have a system to take care of those reactions. I will just mention a few other groups which we mostly have ignored after the accidents. One of them is the people who handled the dead bodies, like people working, taking care of them ashore. Some of them were young conscripts in the military, 19, 18 years old. They had just been out of high school and they came into a very traumatic situation. That's part of the military system in any country. Also in Poland, I believe, that they will be called into action in case something happens like that. Today, of course, is a long time since, but the trauma reappears and we get the post-traumatic reactions. And I guess you all know something about post-traumatic reactions, but it might be a lot of different emotional reactions to trauma. It might be psychiatric conditions which suddenly comes in old age, the trauma of the past coming back, nightmares, and also nervous reactions. But it might also be other kind of reactions which are more somatic. Stress and emotional reactions are not only psychological, but it also is physical. Or I would like to say it results in physical effects as well. For social workers and health workers, it's important to be aware of trauma which comes later in life, which might be connected to something in the past. In my mother's case, soon 97 years old, it's connected to her loss of physical abilities. She always coped with stress through working in the gardens, like many old ladies, tending her tomatoes and cucumbers and doing things like that. It was her way of handling stress, weaving and working on a farm, rather a traditional Norwegian life. In old life, we often find that people do not have their normal methods of coping with stress. And the coping with stress is not only talking, but it's also doing things on a practical level. Most of the handling of stress is actually not talking, but it's about walking on trips, tending animals, doing practical things. When I came here, it's also because I wanted to emphasize that post-traumatic reactions is something that we have to work with. And we have to work with it not only with words and talking, but also from the way of finding practical strategies for individuals, which always will be different, to handle the stress. In my mother's case, it's finding ways of dealing with post-traumatic reactions which are practical. And it's about doing practical things. She's not very good at talking. After the 9th or 11th in the United States, the Twin Tower terror incident, we found that most people handle stress or traumatic reactions through doing practical things. And quite a number of those who went to therapy and who went to psychiatrists and psychologists were traumatized by being forced to talk about the accidents. We should be aware that forcing people to talk is not always helpful. Sometimes it takes a long time before people want to talk. And as I emphasized, we need to find ways of dealing with life, even if our physical abilities change, which means that we will have to find new strategies of dealing with our problems. Some people who do not talk after the accidents, they wish to talk later in age. Perhaps at that time they're more prepared to talk, and that will be helpful because they can't do it by tending the animals or doing some practical things. Marie and I have also discussed a lot the historical dimension of various accidents and the importance of trying to understand what really happened. Part of the trauma for the lady that was interviewed 3 days ago was not understanding really what happened, not having any answers. And the Alexander Kielland accident is one example of an accident where there are many theories of what happened. And many people do not know really what happened with their parents or with their fathers. It was only men that died.
And what was the reason?
And what was the reason behind the accident? In Norway, we had very closed process after the accident.
No, in England?
In Norway, we had a closed.
Yeah, closed process,
but
yes.
In England, after the Piper Alpha accident, which was 8 years later, 167 people killed. They were killed in explosions and in the fire. It was a very, very open process. It was totally open. It was open hearings. Everything was very open. But Norwegian tradition for having hearings was fairly closed. The pure factual documentation of accidents and the explanations, even down to the individual details, is in a way somewhat healing. It gives answers that many people have not dared to ask. We have made 2 books after the Alexander Kielland accident. Both of them have been in Norwegian, but they have served as very important documents in order to make people connect. Perhaps not so much important for those who were in the accidents, the survivors, but for the relatives and for the 2nd and 3rd generation. At the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, they have had a similar project, which is seemingly historical, but it has also served as a kind of connecting process for the survivors and their families. I would like to emphasize that I'm mostly working in my present position. I'm professor of social work, and I'm also working within special teaching. I'm mostly working with present-day problems. But they are always connected to the challenges of the past. And part of this trauma is also a Polish trauma. There were Polish ships involved in the accident. And some of the people involved in the accident came from Poles which had settled in Norway many after the Second World War. So it's also connected to Poland. And the same thing about the Piper Alpha accident. Many of the workers on the Piper Alpha oil platform had some kind of connection to Poland. So going into the details of the individual families give us a kind of understanding that this trauma was really a European trauma, connecting to many nations through family connections, and sometimes through the fellowship of people working within the same field. Coming from a sea nation, we often talk about the fellowship of the sea. Now I know this is far from the sea, but still many Polish families are also connected to the sea in various ways. So they're also part of the same kind of fellowship of people which are connected to the sea and their families. Now, from a practical level, I have been visiting nursing homes several places in Norway recently, and I've been speaking with old people with various cognitive capabilities about the past. Sometimes we have no language, but still we have the experiences of the past which are shaping their present. A few weeks ago, I gave a lecture in Norway talking with nurses and medical doctors about how trauma of the past is shaping the present caring situations for their patients. So coming here, I'm talking about something which is really shaping all of us. I'm talking about how your grandparents and or perhaps even grandparents' trauma is shaping your life today, and how trauma is communicated from one generation to another one, and how it shapes how we react in dealing with our children, or the children we might have in some time in future. I guess most of you are in the age where you have no children yet, but still, statistically speaking, many of you will have children at one point. I talked with your translator a little bit before I started, and she said it was a rather philosophical theme I was talking about. But from my point of view, of course, it is very philosophical, because it's about how a whole generation or community or how family traditions are shaped. But it's also very practical. And from the point of view of those nurses and those medical doctors, it was very practical. It was about how picking up signals of the past and how that was shaping the lives of those individuals they were having as patients. It was about how to pick up the signals and how to work with the families of those people they had as patients. The research on post-traumatic stress shows that about 2/3 or about 70% of people who have been through great trauma copes very well after 2-3 years. The lady we interviewed 3 days ago was rather statistical. She had coped with life, but 2/3 of her family had continuous, but the others in her family had continuous problems. If we take many families like that, it will be just the opposite statistic. Going into big material like that, we find, of course, all the severe reactions to post-traumatic stress. We find suicide, we find alcoholism, we find health problems of various kinds.
And medical abuse.
Sorry?
Medical.
Well, different kind of addictions. Maria has been doing quite some research on drug addiction, abuse of medicines, addiction to medicines, and abuse and addiction to narcotics. And it's a clear connection, statistical connection. But of course, being faced with a person who is addicted or who have problems is not only about dealing with that person's individual problems. It's also about dealing with the problems of the family and the connections and all those around. And often the most important focus for a social worker or a health worker will be the family or those around the person who has been directly involved in an accident or been through a trauma. Talking about problems and challenges or finding ways of communicating about the trauma of the past is often a way of a healing process, or at least not only a healing process. You can never do something about the death, but you can make people find strategies of how to deal with it. And it's often easier if it's some kind of openness about it. It's also very important to make families find strategies of how to deal with the differences they have in dealing with the stress or the trauma of the past. Some people feel like doing some physical things, while their partner might feel like talking. Typically speaking, the female wants to talk and the man wants to do something practical. Living in a rural community, the man often wants to go hunting or chopping wood or doing something practical like that. So openness is also about being open about the differences of coping with stress, which means that we have to talk about not only the trauma, but also how we are dealing with it and how we are communicating. And some people feel like communicating through practical caring, other people by talking. My mother's case is interesting from that point of view. She was rather opposite of the traditional sex roles. She will always do the practical things. Tending the hen, tending the animals, tending the garden, shoveling snow in the winter time, while my father wanted to talk. A great frustration for my father was my mother's inability to talk, while great frustration for my mother was my father not being accepting that she wanted to tend the hens and do the practical things in the garden. Differences like that might be amusing on a distance, but they are rather challenging if you live in them. The British Nobel Prize winner Doris Lessing wrote a book about her father and her mother and how their trauma from the First World War shaped her later life. She said that her whole life was shaped by a trauma from before she was born. You also had a Nobel Prize winner, and her name is so difficult to pronounce, perhaps you find it. That did the same through poetry. That's right. Well, I can see the time is nearly at the end of this lecture, and I've been talking rather broadly about the subject, which has a lot of details, and we could go into a lot of different details about it. Of course, I could have gone more. We could have looked into the details of the different accidents. Piper Alpha accident, 167 killed, 2 crewmen, 61 workers survived with severe injuries. Of course, big accidents like that are also about big injuries. The Piper Alpha accident, which involved some people, also I believe with Polish background, had a severe impact on the small communities in Scotland. Looking into the aspect of injuries, like after a big fire, is also looking into how to cope with life on a physical level with big injuries and burns, which take a long time to heal, and with pain which will be ongoing for the rest of your life. But still, coastal communities, we find, have some kind of way of dealing with big stress like that, because they have been used through the generations of losing family members and some members of the community. Quite some of those families have lost someone in each generation, going back in time in many generations back. Some of the people involved in the oil sector have the situation, some of the widows who lost their husbands, that their sons will go at sea. So they risk the same kind of death. From the point of view of pedagogy, this presentation is very bad because I have not been communicating with you. I have not been asking for your comments. So if you have any questions, please give them to me and I will try to answer any question you might have.
Okay, I have a question. So the stereotype is that Norwegians are more, emotionally distant and quite emotionally and life enduring. They have strong emotional endurance. Well, this is the stereotype. Does your research confirm this?
We confirm that it was a judicial process, which was like that in the Norwegian case, while it was a more open process in the British case. But I do think that is something in it, that's part of the fact in many Norwegian communities. Still, I think it's a lot of family differences. We have to, looking into trauma, we have to go into individual families and individual communities. And even within Norway, we find that there are great differences in how the local communities deal with the trauma. And we find some very, very skilled people, individuals most often, like one of the priests in one of the communities, which was very particularly hard struck. He was very clever with communicating. In another community, it was a union leader in a trade union, which was and the colleagues, which were very active. And in the third community, it was an employer. And then, of course, there are some particularly skilled individuals within the health and social services involved. But mostly they are individuals. And mostly they are individuals which have the ability of seeing the individual and seeing the whole family. And seeing the whole family in a long-time perspective. Most health and social services do not have the long-term perspective to pick up problems of post-traumatic stress. And mostly they only see the people which are directly involved in the accident and not all the others. Like, for instance, this young boy who's conscripted just after high school, barely 18 years old, and being put in the position of watching the dead bodies. Nobody has ever talked with him about his reactions. On the other, all platforms nearby, there were young people in the same age group put in the same position. Nobody has ever talked with the 16 and 15 years old, taking care of the survivors, being volunteers to the Red Cross. When I'm saying this, it's not only trauma, it's also a position of great growth. Some of those young people really feel like they have grown from the experience. They did something important. They're very proud of their effort, and they're very proud of what they did in life, taking care of those survivors, or they were doing something really important. So it's not only negative. Being through a big accident has also a big potential for growth. Big accidents have a potential of growth for nations and communities in a way that they unite people. But the ability of dealing with post-traumatic reactions is the long-term memory and the ability to continuously pick up the traumas of the past, even in old age, like my mother having traumas from a war in 1939. Well, I think I've used my time. Well, thank you for the attention, and thank you for coming.